Yeah, I saw the Russian letter, yeah. The 9,216th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is Threats to International Peace and Security. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting: Ms. Izumi Nakamitsu, High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, and Mr. Daniel Kovalik, CSO Representative. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Ms. Izumi Nakamitsu.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, distinguished members of the Security Council, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I have been requested to brief on the issue of supplies of lethal weapons to Ukraine and their consequences. This follows a similar briefing I provided in September to the Security Council. Since the Russian invasion of Ukraine on 24th of February 2022, a number of states have transferred weapon systems and ammunition to Ukraine for its defense forces. This, as I noted in September, is a matter of public record. Information from governments regarding their transfers is largely accessible through open sources. Such transfers have included heavy conventional weapons, including battle tanks, armored combat vehicles, large caliber artillery systems, missile systems, uncrewed combat aerial vehicles, as well as small arms and light weapons. There have also been widespread and independently verified reports of the transfer of major conventional weapon systems to non-state armed groups involved in the conflict against Ukraine, including artillery rocket systems. The large-scale influx of weapons into any situation of armed conflict raises many concerns for peace and security, including risks of diversion as well as potential spillover and escalation. Measures to counter the potential diversion of weapons and ammunition will be key to post-conflict recovery and regional security and stability, as well as to conflict prevention in other regions. Such measures include pre-transfer risk assessments and post-shipment controls, including on-site inspections and end-user verification. Of equal importance is the need to safeguard and account for transferred military equipment. To enhance transparency in arms transfers, the United Nations Register of Conventional Arms, remains a key tool, as does the Arms Trade Treaty. It is also an important tool to track the influx of weapons and ammunition in conflict zones. These are all widely accepted general policy approaches by member states, which we encourage all to follow. Madam President, beyond addressing arms transfers, all parties to conflict have a duty to protect civilians when conducting military operations. Since 24th of February, the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights has recorded 17,181 civilian casualties, with the numbers increasingly rising. Most of the civilian deaths and injuries continue to be caused by the use of explosive weapons with wide area effects, including attacks by heavy artillery, multiple launch rocket systems, missiles, and aircraft. In addition to thousands of civilians killed and injured, we have witnessed the destruction of civilian and critical infrastructure and services, especially using missiles and uncrewed aerial vehicles. Aside from homes, schools, roads, and bridges destroyed, hospitals and health facilities have also been impacted. The disruption of water, gas, heating, and electricity caused by Russian attacks on energy infrastructure is of particular concern, with the onset of winter bringing a new dimension to the humanitarian crisis and putting millions of people at risk. Under international humanitarian law, combatants must not direct attacks against civilians or civilian infrastructure and must take all feasible precautions in the conduct of military operations to avoid or at least minimize incidental loss of civilian life, injury to civilians, and damage to civilian objects. Since 2007, 2 Secretary Generals have expressed their serious concerns over the humanitarian impact of explosive weapons in populated areas. They have consistently called upon parties to conflict to avoid their use due to the high likelihood of indiscriminate effects. Last month, on 18 November, more than 80 states adopted the political declaration on strengthening the protection of civilians from the humanitarian consequences arising from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. This declaration marks a milestone in our efforts to better protect civilians from the consequences of armed conflict. I call on member states to give effect to this declaration. The past 9 months have seen tremendous devastation, much as a result of the use of heavy conventional weapons. Attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure must stop. I also urge states to apply effective arms control measures to address the risks related to arms transferred. I want to reiterate, preventing diversion of supplied weapons and ammunition is essential to avoid fueling conflict and insecurity in the region and beyond. Madam President, distinguished members of the Security Council, the only way to end the suffering and devastation in Ukraine is by ending the war. I appeal to all member states to make every effort for peace. I thank you very much for your attention.
I thank Ms. Nakamitsu for her briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. Daniel Kovalik.
Good evening, Madam President. Thank you. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Dan Kovalik. I am a professor of international human rights at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law. I've taught there now for 10 years. I graduated from Columbia Law School in the great city of New York in 1993. And I've been very involved in human rights issues, human rights cases, particularly in Latin America, particularly in Colombia, South America, which has a major problem with arms going into the wrong hands, into the hands of guerrilla groups as well as right-wing paramilitary groups. And so this has been something I've been following for years, and so I want to share what I've also been studying and learning also about Ukraine and arms shipments there and the danger of those ending up in the wrong hands. So with your forbearance, I'll get right down to it. First of all, I would call your attention to a study done by the German Federal Foreign Office, the publication of the Small Arms Survey in January 2021 called Making the Rounds, Illicit Ammunition in Ukraine. Again, this is from January 2021. This is even before the major conflict began earlier this year. And what they say is that the outbreak of the conflict in eastern Ukraine in 2014, which we have to remember, that's when it really began, led to the widespread proliferation of small arms, light weapons, and their ammunition. This ammunition, which includes thousands of grenades, rockets, mortar rounds, and landmines, along with vast quantities of firearms cartridges, has spread to nearly every oblast region of Ukraine, including areas located far from the conflict zone. And they said that while the Ukrainian government has taken steps to reduce trafficking of these arms. They said these are daunting tasks given the sheer volume of illicit ammunition in circulation and the numerous modes of transport and smuggling techniques used by traffickers in Ukraine. Now, while they conclude that at that time there was not major transfers of those arms outside of Ukraine, they warn, again, this is 2021, that said, the barriers to smuggling grenades, rockets, and other ammunition out of Ukraine are hardly insurmountable. Even a successful trafficking scheme could radically alter the profile of illicit weapons in some countries. Preventing such schemes and reducing civilian casualties caused by loose ammunition in Ukraine will require a coordinated, sustained effort by Ukrainian authorities and the international community for many years to come. This is 2021. Now let's fast forward a bit. So this is a warning, really, given what comes next. And that is the intervention which began in February of 2022. So as my colleague said, a lot of the information on this can be found in open sources. So here's an article from April of 2022. This is merely 2 months after the war began with the Russian intervention in February. This is a CNN article. What happens to weapons sent to Ukraine? The U.S. really doesn't know. That's the title of the article. And it goes on to explain, the U.S. has few ways to track the substantial supply of anti-tank, anti-aircraft, and other weaponry it is sent across the border into Ukraine. Sources tell CNN. A blind spot that's due in large part to the lack of U.S. boots on the ground in the country and the easy portability of many of the smaller systems now pouring across the border. It is a conscious risk the Biden administration is willing to take. And they quote a senior defense official who said, this is certainly the largest recent supply to a partner country in a conflict. And at this time, you know, there was probably $30 billion or so military had been sent. By the end of January, that's going to probably be about $100 billion all told from the U.S. alone, right? And he says, but the risk both current U.S. officials and defense analysts say is that in the long term, some of those weapons may wind up in the hands of other militaries and militias the U.S. does not intend to arm. So quoting this official, he says, we have fidelity for a short time, but when it enters the fog of war, we have almost zero. It drops into a black hole and you have almost no sense of it at all after a short period of time. In making the decision to send billions of dollars of weapons and equipment into Ukraine, the Biden administration factored in the risk that some of the shipments may ultimately end up in unexpected places, a defense official said. They also quote other officials saying, look, the U.S. really does not have a hold over where these weapons are going. They're depending on Ukraine for information regarding that. And privately, this is according to CNN, officials recognize that Ukraine has an incentive to give only information that will bolster their case for more aid, more arms, and more diplomatic assistance. So in the end, again, in April, they're warning that these arms are going to end up in places we don't want. And of course, they give the example of Afghanistan, where, of course, the U.S. left in a hurry and left, you know, how millions, if not billions of dollars of equipment there, and God knows where that is going to end up. By the way, I want to mention, before I go on much further, that I just spent a week in Donetsk, and I did not myself witness illicit transfers of arms, but, you know, I did see the effects of arms that apparently went into the right hands, and these were ordinances, you know, shelling done by Ukraine against a school, against a stadium, against a place people go to get water, because, of course, water is at a premium in Ukraine. I'm sorry, in Donetsk in particular, because the water filtration system had been destroyed by Ukrainian forces sometime before. And I've been reading that shelling's only increased since I was there. Oh, by the way, a monastery that we helped deliver clothes to, that's being shelled almost daily by Ukraine. So while I'm focusing on illicit arms or arms going to the wrong people, even when it's going to the right people, it's not necessarily ending up in the right places. It's attacking civilians, and that's been happening since 2014, I want to underscore. And that's obviously a problem. And then in June of 2022, you have this article in The Guardian of London. Arms sent to Ukraine will end up in criminal hands, says Interpol chief. Jürgen Stock urges members to cooperate on arms tracing as weapons will flood hidden economy when war ends. So he's saying this with a matter of certainty. Jürgen Stock says once the conflict ends, a wave of guns and heavy arms will flood the international market. He urged Interpol's member states, especially those supplying weapons, to cooperate on arms tracing. Once the guns fall silent in Ukraine, he said, the illegal weapons will come. We know this from many other theaters of conflict. The criminals are even now, as we speak, focusing on them. Criminal groups, again, this is still quoting the head of Interpol. Criminal groups try to exploit these chaotic situations and the availability of weapons, even those used by the military, and including heavy weapons. These will be available on the criminal market, will create a challenge. No country or region can deal with it in isolation because these groups operate at a global level. Quote, again, the same Interpol chief, we can expect an influx of weapons in Europe and beyond. We should be alarmed, and we have to expect these weapons to be trafficked not only to neighboring countries, but to other continents. August 2022, CBS News did a documentary, and they have an article about the documentary. Again, why military aid in Ukraine may not always get to the front lines. And they have detail how they estimated back in April, Jonas Oman, who's the founder and CEO of Blue Yellow, a Lithuanian-based organization that has been meeting with and supplying frontline units and non-lethal military aid in Ukraine since the start of the conflict in 2014, said that back in April, he estimated that, quote, 30 to 40% of the supplies coming across the border reached its destination. So you're talking about potentially billions of dollars of equipment not reaching the intended destination. The same article from CBS goes on to say a combination of Ukraine's constantly shifting front lines with its largely volunteer and paramilitary forces has made delivery of the military aid difficult for those attempting to navigate the dangerous supply lines to their destination. Some have raised concerns about weapons falling into Ukraine's black market, which has thrived on corruption since the collapse of the Soviet Union, right, in 1991. So this isn't anything new. This isn't anything we should be surprised about. This is something that we should have been prepared for. But as I go on, you'll see that we have been woefully unprepared, almost willfully unprepared for this. So November 1, 2022, the Washington Post, U.S. races to track American arms in heat of Ukraine war. And what they say is that U.S. monitors have inspected just 10% of high-risk weapons sent to Ukraine. This is incredible. This is November. Again, for months, for years, they're saying, get a hold of this stuff. In November, a little over a month ago, they're saying, well, we've probably looked at about 10% of them. Though they said the Biden administration hoped to achieve a reasonable level of compliance with U.S. oversight rules, but admitted it certainly would not achieve 100%. I mean, this, again, should be troubling to anyone. Rachel Stoll, the vice president for research programs at the Washington-based Stimson Center, this is the same article, Washington Post, said officials also must develop long-term plans to ensure the security of surplus U.S. weapons once the conflict with Russia ends, noting, again, Ukraine's history as a theater for small arms smuggling after the Cold War. Again, this has been going on for decades. The challenges in Ukraine echo the larger concerns about how weapons produced in the U.S., the largest global weapons seller, are employed worldwide. Advocates have long complained that despite systems designed to prevent their misuse, foreign partners have sometimes employed those arms against civilians in places including Yemen. Well, we know that, right? I mean, in Yemen, since 2015, the Saudis have used U.S. munitions, including cluster bombs, to attack civilians and civilian infrastructure, and UNESCO historic sites as well. Sophisticated equipment has also fallen into adversaries' hands, allowing the Islamic State to showcase Abrams tanks and the Taliban to pilot Black Hawk helicopters. Again, none of this surprising, but what's being done? Very little about it. Then you have the Voice of America. Okay, this is, the U.S. itself, more or less speaking, quoting the Nigerian president, November 30th, 2022, Ukraine war funneling arms fighters into Lake Chad Basin. So the Nigerian president is complaining this is already happening. He says the war between Russia and Ukraine is allowing arms and fighters to stream into the Lake Chad region, bolstering the strength of terrorist groups. Of course, we saw in the same region, in Chad, in the Sahel region of Africa, after the NATO's bombing campaign and war on Libya, illicit arms flooded the Sahel region and fighters as well, destabilized places like Tunisia, Chad, Mali, and even Syria, right? You should read Seymour Hersh's piece about that, Pulitzer Prize winning Seymour Hersh's article about that transfer of fighters to Syria from Libya. But in any case, so this is already happening, according to the Nigerian president. Weapons from Ukraine are already ending up in the hands of extremists. Finally, in terms of what I'm relying on, you can look at an interesting opinion piece in The Hill publication from thehill.com. This is December 7th. This is 2 days ago, 2022. Preventing U.S. weapons from escaping Ukraine is a challenge. Again, underscoring the difficulty, if not impossibility, of getting a handle on all these weapons, which goes back to the first report saying we need international oversight over this. And with respect, and I'm an American, so I can say this, the U.S. isn't going to do it. In fact, 2 days ago, the same day this was written, a House committee that was considering whether to do an audit on weapons transfers to Ukraine and money sent to Ukraine, that resolution was voted down. Congress affirmatively decided we're not going to audit the billions and billions of dollars of weaponry we're sending to Ukraine. As an American taxpayer, I can say I don't like that, but I would think as the Security Council in charge of maintaining international peace and security, you shouldn't like that. Who is watching the watchman here? It is the job of the Security Council to do that. I urge you to do that, but I'll also
Mr.
echo
Kovalik,
the
could I
point of my
just
colleague who
could I
opened
just
this,
interrupt you
that
for
the
a
only
minute?
way to
I think we
deal
are
with this-
running short of time. May I request you to
Okay.
to round off as soon as you can? Thank you.
Yes, I'm gonna wind up right now. I just want to reiterate the comments of my colleague who opened this session, saying that what really has to happen is the end of this war, a negotiated end of this war, which I think is possible. We know back in March or April, there was apparently a deal that both sides could have lived with, that apparently Boris Johnson from the UK went and told Zelensky not to sign. But apparently there is a deal, some way to end this conflict. This needs to be ended, and it needs to be ended through negotiated settlement. And again, I urge the Security Council to work towards that end. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kowalik, for your briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the Russian Federation.
Госпожа председатель,
Thank you, Madam President.
благодарим наших
We would like
сегодняшних
to thank
бриферов,
our
в
briefers,
частности
today,
господина
in
Ковалика,
particular
потому
Mr.
что он
Kowalik,
затронул одну из
because he
тем,
touched upon
ради которой
one
мы
of the
и попросили
topics,
созвать сегодняшнего заседания.
for which we ask for the
Конкретно
convening of the meeting
последствия
today,
растущих
specifically
контрабандных
the
поставок
consequences of
этого
growing smuggling
оружия, поставляемого
of
Украине в различные
the
регионы
weapons
земного шара
which
для
is
международного мира и безопасности.
being provided into Ukraine. It's
Еще одной
spread in
целью
various
созванного
regions
заседания
of the world, and it's a threat to international peace and security. Another goal of the meeting today
Созвано оно для того, чтобы члены Совета могли дать
it was
оценку того,
convened
какое
so that
воздействие
members of the council could
продолжающаяся массированная накачка
assess
Украины западным оружием
what is the
оказывает
impact
на
of the
перспективу
continuous
завершения
pumping of
украинского
Ukraine
конфликта.
with Western weapons, what kind of impact it has on the
Как вы
prospects
все
for
хорошо
the ending of the
помните, вскоре
Ukrainian
после
conflict.
начала нашей
As
специальной
you
военной операции,
recall
одной из
very
целей
well,
которых
soon
являлась
after the beginning of
демилитаризация
this
Украины,
special military
стало очевидно,
operations, one
что
goal
военный
of that
потенциал
was to
собственной украинской
demilitarize
армии быстро
Ukraine. It became
истощается.
obvious that the military potential of Ukraine itself is being
Соответственно, момент,
quickly
когда
depleted.
киевский
Therefore,
режим
the
в Украине
time
перестал бы
when the
представлять
Kiev regime
угрозу
in
для нашей
Ukraine would
страны,
stop being
стремительно
a threat to our
приближался.
country was becoming closer and closer.
Такой сценарий, однако,
But
не
this
мог устроить
scenario,
наших бывших
however,
западных
did not
партнеров.
sit well with our former Western
Они не для
partners.
этого
And that is
организовывали
not
на
why
Украине
they
нелегитимный
organized
госпереворот в
an
2014 году,
illegitimate coup d'etat in Ukraine in
поощряли там
2014.
махровый
That's not why
национализм и
they encouraged
русофобию,
nationalism and
перевооружали
Russophobia. That's
украинскую
not why
армию,
they rearmed the
делая вид,
Ukrainian
что
army,
контролируют
pretending
выполнение
that they're
Киевом Минских
verifying the
соглашений.
implementation of the Minsk
А на
agreements by
самом деле,
Kiev, whereas in actual
стремясь
fact,
реализовать свои
they were trying to
геополитические
implement
планы по
their
ослаблению
geopolitical
России.
plans to weaken Russia.
О том, что Минские соглашения
And
были
the fact that the Minsk
только
agreements
ширмой
were
для
just a
перевооружения
screen in order
ВСУ,
to
нам только
rearm the
что
armed forces
цинично
of
поведала
Ukraine was
бывший канцлер
something that
Германии
we
Ангела
were
Меркель.
just now told by the former chancellor of Germany, Ms. Merkel, quite
Тогда
cynically.
в ход пошел
At
аргумент о
the
том, что допустить
time,
поражение
then the
Украины
argument
Западу
came into
никак
play
нельзя.
that the West
Во-первых,
cannot
она
allow
якобы после
Ukraine to
поражения
lose
перестанет существовать как
because
независимое государство.
after a military defeat,
Хотя
Ukraine
мы
will
никогда
stop existing
подобных
as an
планов
independent
не озвучивали.
state, even though we have never said anything like
Во-вторых,
that. Secondly, it
милитаризм
was
и
because
имперские
militarism
амбиции
and the
Кремля
imperial
Украины
ambitions of
якобы
the
не ограничиваются. И
Kremlin
Киев,
will
дескать,
not be
защищает не только себя,
limited
но
by
и
Ukraine,
весь
and Kiev
свободный мир.
therefore allegedly
Но
protects
этот
not
бредовый
just
тезис
themselves
вообще
but
нет
also the
смысла даже
entire
комментировать.
free world. And this is an absurd
Однако
thesis
оба
that I'm
этих
not even going
абсолютно
to
ложных утверждения
comment.
стали
But all
обоснованием
of
для
these
запуска
statements
лихорадочной
became
кампании по
foundation
вооружению
for a
Украины
frenetic
и
campaign to
оказанию ей
arm
косвенной военной
Ukraine
поддержки.
and indirectly
Именно
militarily
тогда и
support it.
началась
And
война
that's
по
when the
доверенности США и
proxy
их
war by
союзников
the
по НАТО
United States
против
and its
России
NATO
до
allies against
последнего
Russia
украинца.
began, the war that's continued until the very last Ukrainian.
Столь масштабная военная
Such
поддержка,
a
наверное, не
large-scale
оказывалась
military
ни одному
support
государству в
was
истории.
probably never extended to any state in history.
Посудите сами,
You
совокупный
can judge
объем
for
военной
yourself the
помощи
overall volume
одного
of military
Вашингтона
assistance
Киеву,
from
по
Washington
данным
alone to
Американского
Kiev,
центра
according to
международной
the
политики,
American
только с
Center for
февраля
International
до
Policy.
начала октября этого года
From
составил
February to
40
October
миллиардов долларов.
alone was
Если
the amount
добавить
of
к ним
$40
миллиарды
billion.
долларов,
If
обещанные или
you
уже
add to that the
выделенные
billions of
Евросоюзом
dollars promised or
Великобритании,
already given
то
to
становится
EU or
ясно,
the
что на
UK,
вооружение
then it becomes
и
clear
помощь Украине
that the
менее
arming
чем
and assistance
за
to
год
Ukraine
была
for
потрачена
less
сумма,
than a year took
превышающая
up the
военные
amount which
бюджеты большинства
exceeds the military
государств.
budgets of the most NATO states.
Помимо поставок
In
оружия,
addition to
США и
weapons
НАТО еще и
supplies, the
снабжают
United
киевский
States and
режим
NATO are
разведданными,
also
в том числе
giving
со
intelligence
спутников,
data to the
обеспечивают
Kiev
украинские
regime using
подразделения
satellites as
интернет-связи,
well. They provide
осуществляют
internet
подготовку
links,
инструкторов.
they train them,
Если
Ukrainian
же к
units.
этому
If
добавить
you add to
тысячи,
that
если
the
не десятки
thousands, if not
тысяч
tens of thousands
иностранных
of foreign
наемников и сотрудников
mercenaries
частных
or
военных
private
компаний,
military company
о
members
наличии которых мы
whose
узнаем по их
presence we
трупам и
discover
переговорам
when we
радиоэфира,
find their bodies or
возникает резонный вопрос.
their talks
Украинцы
on
ли
the
на
radio.
самом деле
Then the following
противостоят
question
российской
comes up: Is
армии
it
в этой
really
стране?
the Ukrainians who are facing
Одно
the
можно
Russian
сказать
army
точно.
in this
Без
country? One
упомянутой
can be
западной
said
помощи
for sure:
военные действия на
without
Украине уже
Western
давно бы
assistance, the
закончились.
military
И это признают
activities
сами
in
лидеры
Ukraine
преступного
would
киевского
have
режима.
come to an end a long time ago, and this is something that
Давайте
the
посмотрим, какие
leaders of
последствия,
the
кроме затягивания
Kiev regime
бессмысленной
say
агонии
themselves.
киевской
Well, let's
клики и
take a look at
продолжения
the
страданий
consequences
простых
of the
украинцев,
prolonging
имеют
of
все
the
эти
agony of
недальновидные
the
действия
Kiev
наших западных
regime, what kind
Вооружения и боеприпасы старого
The old
советского
Soviet
образца
weapons
нами на
and
Украине достаточно
ammunition
быстро
used in
перемалываются.
Ukraine is something that we destroy fairly
Поскольку
quickly.
их в принципе
And
осталось
because there are
мало,
very few of them
Запад все чаще
left, the
поставляет
West
режиму
is
Зеленского
providing the
вооружение
Zelensky
западного образца и
regime
более современного
with
типа,
Western
среди которых есть и
weapons,
дальнобойные
which
артиллерийские и
also
ракетные
includes
системы.
long-range artillery and
Вот на
rocket
них стоило бы
systems. And this
остановиться
is
особо,
something that I
поскольку
would
они
like to dwell
позволяют
upon
ВСУ
because
наносить
they
удары
allow the
по
Ukrainian
мирным
armed
районам
forces to
Донбасса, до
strike
которых
the
украинские артиллеристы раньше
peaceful areas of
попросту не могли
Donbass, which used to be
дотянуться.
inaccessible to Ukrainian artillery
За
before.
примерами далеко
And
ходить не надо.
examples
Вчера мы
abound.
распространили в
Yesterday,
качестве
we
документа Совета
disseminated
Безопасности
in the
Генеральной
Security
Ассамблеи
Council and
письмо
General Assembly
Донецкой
a
общественной
letter
организации
from a
«Справедливая
Donetsk
защита»
civil society
с
organization, which is called
описанием
Just Defense. It
неизбирательных обстрелов
describes
жилых
the
и густонаселенных
random
районов.
strikes of residential, densely populated
Из этого
area.
документа
And
следует,
this
что
document
последние недели в
shows
Донецке
that
происходит
in the recent
настоящая
weeks,
бойня с
what we're witnessing
применением
in
западного
Donetsk is a
оружия.
massacre using Western weapons.
Наускиваемые
Being
западными
egged
странами,
on by
украинские
Western
каратели
countries,
пытаются
the
буквально сломать
Ukrainians
город
are
землей.
literally trying to raze the city to the
С
ground.
какой-то остервенелой злобой наносятся
With
ежедневные
great
веерные удары по
hatred,
жилым
there are
районам,
daily
где нет и
strikes
не
on
может быть
residential
военных целей.
areas which cannot possibly contain any
Очередной такой
military
преступный
targets.
обстрел произошел
Another
сегодня
such
утром.
shelling took place this morning.
Места массового
Places where
скопления людей
people
поражаются в
congregate
самый
are
час
being
пик, что
struck
приводит
during
к
rush
значительным
hour,
жертвам и
which leads
разрушениям.
to a large number of
4 декабря,
victims and
например,
destruction. On the 4th of
управляемым
December, for
артиллерийским
example, a
снарядом
guided artillery shell
М982
M982
«Экскалибр»
Excalibur,
калибром 155
caliber
мм
155
атакован
millimeters,
дворец
was
спорта
used
«Дружба»,
to
в котором
strike the
организована
sports center
раздача
Druzhba,
питьевой
where
воды
people are being
мирным
distributed
жителям.
drinking water.
Из-за того, что еще в
The
феврале
reason for
Украина
that is
отрезала
that in
Донбасс от
February
единственного
already
источника
Ukraine cut
водоснабжения.
Donbass off from
Это
their
не
own
замечают
source of
наши
water
западные
supply.
коллеги, еще
Our
8
Western
лет назад
colleagues
фактически
do not
отказавшие
notice that
мирному
because already
населению
8 years ago
Донбасса
they
в праве на
denied the
человеческое
right of
существование.
people in Donbass to have a
Сожалеем,
decent
что и
human
у
existence.
чиновников
We
секретариата
regret also
ООН не
that the
нашлось
members of the UN
смелости осудить
Secretariat were not
обстрелы
brave
Донецка,
enough to
хотя по
condemn the
ударам по
shelling of
украинской территории
Donetsk,
они высказываются постоянно.
even though they speak out on strikes against
Число
Ukrainian
погибших на
territory all
Донбассе
the
только
time.
с
The number of
27
people who
ноября
died in
22
Donbass
мирных
since the
жителя,
27th of
большинство из
November is
которых жители
22,
Донецка.
most of them from
83
Donetsk.
гражданских лица
83 civilian
получили
people were
ранения.
wounded.
Повреждены 234 многоквартирных
234
жилых дома,
residential
106
buildings
частных
were
жилых домов,
damaged,
31
106
учреждение
private houses,
образования,
31 education
92 иных
buildings,
инфраструктурных объектов.
92 other infrastructure objects.
Особо
We
обращаем
would like to
внимание,
underscore the
это не
following, that
последствия
this is
падения
not
на жилые кварталы
because an
ракет
air
ПВО, как это
defense rocket
происходит в ряде
fell on
случаев в
residential buildings,
украинских
something
городах,
that happens
а целенаправленные
in a number of
сознательные
cases
удары
in
по
Ukrainian
гражданским
cities, but
объектам
it
и
is a
домам мирных
targeted
жителей.
conscious strikes against
Вооруженные
civilian objects.
формирования Украины без
Ukrainian
колебаний
armed
атакуют из
units do
поставленной
not
НАТО артиллерии
hesitate
и
to use
сооружения,
NATO
содержащие
artillery
опасные вещества.
in order to
7
strike
декабря
buildings
нанесен удар по
containing
действующему
hazardous
химическому
materials. On the
концерну
7th of
«Стирол» в
December, for
Горловке.
example, there's a strike against a chemical
Снаряды
concern,
попали в
Styrol.
хранилище серы, что вызвало пожар.
The sulfur
Сама по себе
warehouse was
горящая
struck.
сера опасности не
It caught
представляет.
fire.
Но в
Sulfur
случае
itself is not dangerous,
при соединении с водой
but
образуется
when
серная
it is
кислота.
compounded with water,
И в случае
sulfuric
определенных погодных
acid comes
условий
into
это может
being,
привести
and
к
this,
выпадению кислоты
under
в
certain conditions, could lead to acid rain.
Среди поставляемого вооружения
Amongst
стоит особо выделить
weapons
американские
supplies, I would
реактивные
like to
системы залпового
underscore
огня
the
«Хаймерс».
HIMARS
Мы
American
точно
systems.
знаем,
We
и это
know
не
for a
раз
fact,
косвенно
and this
подтверждали
was
Киев и
indirectly
Вашингтон,
confirmed
что
by both
американские
Kiev and
специалисты
Washington on many
участвуют в работе этих
occasions. The American
установок.
experts participate in the work of
Наведение «Хаймерс» на цель
of
осуществляется с
HIMARS.
помощью американских
They
военных спутников, а
are
военнослужащие
using
США на
American
земле
satellite
осуществляют
information
координацию
and
спутниковой
American
развединформации,
military on the
загрузку
ground
точных
coordinates
координат
satellite
и
data. They
программное
keep the
обеспечение
coordinates
РСЗО и
into
контроль
the
эффективности применения установок.
HIMARS software, and they control the
Представители Киева
effectiveness of
сами
their use. The
признавали, что ни один
representatives of
выстрел из
Kiev have
«Хаймерс» не
stated
происходит без
themselves that
согласования с
not one
американцами.
single HIMARS strike takes place without
Нас
coordination
постоянно
with the
убеждают в
Americans.
высокой
We're being
технологичности
told
и
all the
высокой
time
точности этого
that
оружия.
this kind of weapon is very
Но
high
оно всегда
technology, high
попадает туда,
precision.
куда
It
планируется.
always strikes where the
Итак,
strike is
какие же так
planned.
называемые
So
военные цели
what
на
are the
Донбассе
military
оказались
goals
поражены
in
этой ракетной
Donbass
установкой с одобрения
ended up being
Вашингтона?
struck by this
Я назову
rocket
лишь некоторые.
launcher with the Washington's
Детский
approval?
сад
Let me
«Снежно»,
name just one. There's a
школа
kindergarten in
искусств в Брянке,
Snezhno, an art
гостиница в
school in
Красном
Bryansk,
Луче,
a hotel in Krasny
волонтерский
Luch,
центр
a
в
volunteer
Степано-Крымке,
center in Stepanakert,
бассейн, школа и
a
кондитерский
swimming pool, a
цех в
school,
Стаханове, санаторий
a
в
bakery
Алчевске,
in Stakhanovo,
дома культуры в
a
Нижней Дуванке,
cultural
Горском,
center in Nizhny
Ясиноватой,
Duvansk, Gorskom, and
Новоайдарске,
Yasnovaty, and the Agrarian College in
Среди
Novaya
жертв,
Darsk. Amongst those who were victims were people who work there. They're doctors, they're teachers, they're volunteers, and bakers. Tens of peaceful people who died because of American missiles. This Sunday, HIMARS missiles hit the buildings of the Donbas technical institutions in the city of Alchevsk. More detailed information on this is contained in the letter that we disseminated. Could these numerous and documented strikes against civilian objects be as a result of a mistake or an accident? Obviously, this is a conscious and intentional participation of the United States and NATO in Kiev regime crimes. And victims among civilians, the damage to social and civilian infrastructure is something that they bear the same personal responsibility as Ukrainian artillery and gunnery personnel. This is factually direct involvement of the United States and NATO in what is happening in Ukraine, but that's not all. We have information that the Russian airfields in Yakovlev and Angeles were attacked using American satellite data. Modernized Soviet drones 2141 were being found targets using American global satellite system GPS. State Secretary Blinken, commenting it, stated that the United States does not encourage or does not enable the Ukrainians to attack the Russian territory. But at the same time, the head of the American corporation, Raytheon Technologies Corporation, Hayes, on the 8th of December, stated the following: "We work with the government and provide in real time information on the situation on the battlefield in Ukraine, including when missiles are launched." Of course, we very carefully note all such crimes committed by the United States and its allies, and they will have legal consequences for all involved. We also follow and destroy the equipment they provide. This equipment is also dwindling in warehouses, and because of that, Washington and allies are trying to actually work with third countries, buying from them equipment and material and giving it to Ukraine. This was acknowledged recently by the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, Kuleba. And we should assess to what extent this is legal. Obviously, Western countries, when they do this, are violating the obligations they have under the International Arms Trade Treaty, which provides for a ban on exports to those regions where this could lead to violations of international humanitarian law and could intensify conflict. But they are not held back by that, and they go even further. On the 30th of November, Secretary Blinken talked about resuming the manufacturing of the Soviet combat systems in Eastern European countries so as to then supply them to the Kiev regime. Organizing the manufacturing of Soviet and Russian weaponry on these factories is regulated by international agreements, which stipulates the commitment not to provide such goods without our consent. In other words, currently the United States is pushing those countries to violate the basic foundational arms control standards. And this is an example of the so-called rules-based order, which is violating, in actual fact, international law. Madam President, another large topic is the spread of the weapons supplied to Ukraine throughout the world. On the September meeting on this topic, we already warned about the risk of these weapons ending up in the hands of terrorists and criminals. This is not our conjecture. These are warnings and concerns of the police forces of European countries themselves. For example, Finnish police received information about weapons supplied to Kiev to criminals in their country as well as in Sweden, Denmark, and Poland. The NATO weaponry that Helsinki hopes will help them defend themselves is now threatening the lives of Finnish citizens. Let me say that the issue of stealing weaponry from Ukrainian warehouses is something that arose a long time ago. In the recent ODC and UNIDER reports, they're talking about the fact that in 2020 they discovered a scheme of illegally supplying weapons from Ukraine into conflict areas in Africa and Middle East. And this was heavy weaponry, including tanks. And they could have only, the tanks could have only come from army with warehouses. Of course, Washington and European capitals know that very well, but pumping Ukraine with weapons was more important. The situation has gone out of control to such an extent that the weaponry for Kiev are now appearing in the black market, not just in Europe, but also in the Middle East and in Africa. Mr. Kovalik has already quoted the president of Nigeria today, who said that the Ukrainian conflict is the main source of weapons for Boko Haram terrorists in the Lake Chad area. Why are these egregious cases of cross-border illegal weapons trafficking in which corrupted Ukrainian officials do participate, as well as obviously European and American officials, are not being investigated? Is this not a direct threat to international peace and security, to which international community should be paying attention? The same also applies to the billions of the so-called assistance to Kiev from military to humanitarian. A large part of it remains in the pockets of interested persons. We know about the discussion about that in European parliaments and the American Congress, but we also see that the ruling elite basically shuts up the opposition when they ask to audit every dollar or every euro sent to Ukraine at the expense of Western taxpayers. In the course of Senate hearings on the audit draft, auditing the assistance to Ukraine by the United States, the representative of the Democratic Party, Connolly, said that he supports transparency and accountability, but not right now. Probably the best illustration of the double standards of the American establishment and their desire to keep their vassal, to support their vassals. Madam President, I know that all those Western countries who will speak after me will try to shift the blame, and they will start talking about the military supplies from Iran to Russia, which have already refuted on many occasions. The military-industrial conflict in Russia can work perfectly fine and doesn't need anyone's assistance, whereas the Ukrainian military industry does not basically exist, and it's being assisted by the Western industry, and Western companies also receive huge profits from that, and they're certainly not going to give up on that for the purpose of establishing peace. I would like to call upon those who can objectively see information, once again, soberly assess the risk coming from the pumping up of the Ukrainian regime with weapons without control, the threats to international peace and security, maintaining which is something that the Security Council needs to deal with. We need to look at it. These threats are not going down, they're growing because the Western countries do not understand that they're fueling the fire by doing so. I thank you.
I thank Russia for their statement, and I would now like to give the floor to the representative of Norway.
Thank you, Madam President, and I thank the briefers for their statements. I will make 5 short points. First, we condemn Russia's war against Ukraine in the strongest possible terms. And second, we reiterate our unwavering support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. Ukraine has a right to self-defense as enshrined in Article 51 of the UN Charter, as well as the sovereign right to ask for and receive support from other states in the exercise of this right. Norway will continue to stand with Ukraine. Third, Russia's war against Ukraine is a blatant violation of international law, including the UN Charter. It is a violation of the core principle on which this organization is built, the sovereign equality of its members, and the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by force. Russia must abide by international law and stop its war of aggression now. Fourth, we are alarmed by the recent increase in Russian attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure. The massive waves of missiles and drone strikes on Ukraine clearly demonstrates Russia's complete disregard for the horrible suffering they are causing millions of people. In addition to causing casualties, these cynical attacks have destroyed a large number of power facilities, leaving Ukraine's population freezing in the middle of the winter. Children, persons with disabilities, and the elderly are in particularly vulnerable situations. They must be protected. Fifth, on the transfer of lethal weapons from Iran by Russia, we recall that all states are obligated to respect the restrictions of Resolution 2231. The use of drones from Iran adds even further to the list of Russia's total disregard for international law, the UN Charter, and the decisions of the very Security Council on which it sits as a permanent member. And finally, Madam President, Russia is the one driving weapon flows into Ukraine, and they do so through their illegal war against Ukraine. Almost 1 year has gone since Russia's aggressive invasion, and it's not too late for them to do the right thing, to respect the UN Charter, to withdraw all troops, and to work for a peaceful solution through dialogue and diplomatic efforts. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Norway, and I give the floor now to the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President, and I thank the High Representative for Disarmament Affairs for her briefing. President, I will be brief because we discussed Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine just 3 days ago. During that meeting, we heard Under Secretary General Griffiths' harrowing account of the horrific consequences of Russia's war and his deep concerns about the impacts of Russia's systematic attacks on Ukraine's infrastructure and civilian centres, particularly ahead of winter. We've just seen further OHCHR reporting on potential atrocities against civilians committed by Russia. The irony, given the topic of this meeting, is that Russia is perpetrating this war, including with weapons sourced from Iran in violation of Resolution 2231, and is almost certainly seeking to source weaponry from other UN-sanctioned states, like North Korea, as its own stocks dwindle. We note that despite the resounding calls in this Council, again on Tuesday, for a ceasefire and for peace, dialogue, and diplomacy, the Russian president on Wednesday doubled down, confirming that the invasion would continue and that it would be protracted. He also reaffirmed the neo-imperialist nature of the campaign, claiming that, unlike Peter the Great, he had made the Sea of Azov a Russian internal sea. President, in the face of Russia's relentless effort to seize Ukraine's territory in violation of the UN Charter and to dehumanize, kill, and subjugate its people, Ukraine has no choice but to exercise its right to defend itself. If it did not, it would cease to exist. In a similar situation, all of us would do the same. And due to the deep determination to live, Ukraine is prevailing. The UK is proud of the support it is providing to Ukrainian people in the face of this aggression. Defensive support, humanitarian support, and assistance to rebuild critical infrastructure destroyed by Russian attacks. President, Russia can end this suffering immediately by ceasing attacks against Ukraine, including critical national infrastructure and innocent civilians, and withdrawing all of its forces illegally present in Ukraine. We welcome and support Ukraine's initiative for a just and sustainable peace. We again join the international community in calling on Russia to similarly commit to meaningful dialogue and negotiations based on upholding Ukraine's rights under international law and the UN Charter. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ghana.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank Madam Izumi Nakamitu for her briefing. My delegation has also taken note of the information provided by the civil society representative, Mr. Daniel Kovalik. I begin my statement by reaffirming Ghana's complete and unwavering commitment to the sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine, and affirm Ukraine's inherent right to self-defense under customary international law, codified in Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter. The stability of our international system has been carefully built upon established norms of interstate relations, one of which is the cardinal prohibition of the use of force by one state against the other. Any contrary actions, as we have witnessed of the Russian Federation against Ukraine, undermine the fundamental principles of international law, the values and the purposes of the United Nations Charter, and constitute serious threats to international peace and security. Over the past 9 months, Ukraine has deployed its military and strategic capabilities in asserting its inherent right to self-defense against the armed attack of the Russian Federation, and in a courageous endeavor to preserve its national interest. To such action, there is no prohibition, and neither do the rules of international law or the Charter prohibit the supply of conventional weapons to a state under the armed attack of another. Regrettably, the war has come at the great cost of destruction, damage, and the loss of lives, and with each passing day of missile attacks, the toll of civilian casualties and damage to Ukraine's critical infrastructure continues to compound as the United Nations registers some of the worst humanitarian statistics since World War II. We also remain acutely aware of the looming danger of a nuclear catastrophe as the integrity of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant is persistently violated. Away from Ukraine, the war has spurred unprecedented levels of global energy, food, and financial crisis, which have derailed the capacity of many developing states to rebound from the impact of the global COVID-19 pandemic, further worsening socio-economic conditions for many communities far removed from the theater of war. It remains in our common interest to end the war and the trail of devastation that is leaving in its path. It is therefore our view that the preoccupation of the international community should be the immediate cessation of military hostilities, a key aspect of which is the unconditional withdrawal of Russian forces from the internationally recognized borders of Ukraine. We reiterate our call on the Russian Federation to end its aggression against Ukraine and to respect its sovereignty and territorial integrity in line with the norms and principles of international law. While diplomatic efforts to end the war may appear to have eluded the international community, we must remain steadfast and unified in our efforts to facilitate a political dialogue with credible guarantees of addressing the respective security concerns of the parties. In its enduring wisdom, the Charter of the United Nations avails several modes of pacific settlement, which promise to deliver our present and collective aspiration for peace in Ukraine, if undertaken with a genuine commitment and greater determination of the warring sides and all stakeholders. We must pursue the path of dialogue, as there can be no military solution to the conflict. Finally, we urge the parties to uphold the rules of international humanitarian law, in particular the requirements for distinction and proportionality to avoid causing needless harm to civilians and civilian infrastructure. I thank you.
I thank Ghana for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Madam President,
我感谢仲满全副秘书长
I thank USG
和科瓦利克先生的
and
通报。
Mr. Kovalik for their briefings.
乌克兰危机持续
The
近
Ukraine
10个月，
crisis has been unfolding for
大
almost
量
10
武器
months
弹
now,
药
and a large amount of
引入乌克
weapons
兰。
and ammunition have poured
在
into the
枪炮之
country.
下，生命
Human
显得
lives appear
如此的脆
so
弱。
fragile in front of gun
交战
barrels.
双方，
Both
特别是
sides
普通民
have
众，
suffered huge
都
losses
遭受了
and immense
巨大
trauma
的
in the
损
fighting,
失和
with
创伤。
ordinary people bearing the brunt.
今年9月，
Ms. Nakamitsu stated in a briefing to the Security Council this past September that a large-scale influx of weapons to conflict-affected zones raises concerns about potential diversion. Ms. Nakamitsu re-emphasized this point in her briefing just then. In June this year, Interpol also indicated that weapons destined for Ukraine could end up on the black market and fall into the hands of criminals. These warnings have unfortunately materialized. There have been reports that some armed groups and terrorist organizations in the Middle East and Africa have obtained through illegal channels weapons and ammunition flowing from Ukraine. The international community should pay attention to this issue and take preventive measures. From a long-term perspective, the large stockpile of weapons, ammunition, and explosives in the Ukrainian territory may pose security risks to post-conflict reconstruction. Afghanistan, Iraq, and Somalia are among the countries that had painful experience in this regard. Madam President, on the Ukrainian issue, China has always advocated the cessation of hostilities as well as dialogue and peace talks. Since the onset of the crisis, China has always stressed that a political solution is the only way out. Flooding the battlefield with weapons and continuously expanding the categories and scope of deployed armaments will only aggravate existing strife, prolong and amplify the conflict, and make ordinary people pay a high price. Facts have shown that resolving the crisis through dialogue and negotiation is the only way to effectively minimize casualties and help restore peace in Ukraine and the entire Europe. China once again calls on the international community to redouble its efforts to encourage peace talks, provide a favorable atmosphere for the parties involved to return to negotiations, and create conditions for political settlement of the Ukraine crisis. During his recent meetings with leaders of several countries and on the issue of Ukraine, President Xi Jinping underscored that conflicts and wars produce no winner, and that a complex issue has no simple solution. In the current situation, China believes that the international community must work together on 4 fronts, namely, jointly support all efforts aimed at peaceful settlement of the Ukraine crisis, while on all parties concerned to stay level-headed, exercise restraint, and make direct contact as soon as possible in order to create conditions for relaunching negotiations. Second, jointly reject the use or threat of nuclear weapons, reaffirm that nuclear weapons should never be used, and nuclear wars should never be fought, and prevent a nuclear crisis on the Eurasian continent. Third, make joint efforts to stabilize the global supply chain and prevent any disruption to international energy, food, and financial cooperation that may undermine global economic recovery, especially the economic and fiscal stability of developing countries. Fourth, jointly provide winter relief for civilians in the crisis-affected areas, improve humanitarian situations on the ground, and prevent humanitarian crises on an even larger scale. China will continue to uphold objectivity and impartiality and work with all peace-loving countries in the world to play a constructive role in the peaceful settlement of the Ukraine crisis. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of China, and I now give the floor to France.
Madame la Présidente, une fois de plus, la Russie essaie de nous faire croire que cette guerre est le fait de l'Ukraine, encouragée par les États-Unis et par l'Europe. Le 24 février dernier, c'est pourtant elle qui a envahi l'Ukraine au mépris du droit international et de la Charte des Nations Unies. C'est elle qui a déclenché cette guerre en agressant unilatéralement son voisin. C'est elle qui prend chaque jour depuis 9 mois la décision de la poursuivre et de l'aggraver. N'inversons pas les responsabilités, ne confondons pas l'agresseur et l'agressé. C'est la Russie seule qui est responsable de la dégradation de la situation humanitaire. Nous avons entendu M. Griffith mardi nous exposer les répercussions désastreuses de ce conflit. La France continue d'apporter au peuple ukrainien tout le soutien dont il a besoin pour exercer son droit à la légitime défense et préserver sa liberté, sa souveraineté et son indépendance. Elle le fait en soutenant militairement l'Ukraine à titre national et au niveau européen, notamment au travers de la Facilité européenne de paix. C'est un choix assumé. L'Ukraine se bat aussi pour les principes de la Charte des Nations Unies. Intégrité territoriale, inviolabilité des frontières, indépendance et souveraineté des États, refus de la conquête des territoires par la force, condamnation des guerres d'agression. Seul le respect de ces principes peut garantir la paix. L'adoption par l'Assemblée générale de la résolution Intégrité territoriale le 12 octobre dernier est une preuve de plus de l'isolement de la Russie. Le président Zelensky l'a également rappelé en plaçant ces principes au cœur de son plan de paix en 10 points, auquel la Russie a offert comme seule réponse la poursuite de ses bombardements indiscriminés contre les infrastructures civiles ukrainiennes et contre la population. Nous saluons ce plan et nous nous tenons prêts à aider l'Ukraine à bâtir une paix juste et durable. La Russie n'hésite pas à violer le droit international en agressant un autre État, mais aussi en se procurant des armes de manière illégale. Alors que ses stocks s'amenuisent et qu'elle se trouve en grande difficulté sur le terrain, elle cherche à s'approvisionner par tous les moyens, y compris en violation des résolutions du Conseil de sécurité. Il est solidement documenté qu'elle a recouru à des drones de combat livrés par l'Iran. Elle continue de les utiliser dans sa stratégie de ciblage systématique de la population et des infrastructures civiles ukrainiennes. Nous appelons le secrétariat des Nations Unies, comme il en a le mandat, à enquêter sur ces transferts qui constituent une violation de la résolution 2231, ainsi qu'à en rendre compte au Conseil de sécurité. La France continuera d'apporter un soutien militaire à l'Ukraine tant que se poursuivra l'agression de la Russie, de même que se poursuivra l'aide humanitaire, économique, politique que nous lui apportons. Si la Russie souhaite que cessent les transferts qu'elle dénonce aujourd'hui, la solution est simple. Elle a été donnée le 16 mars dernier par la Cour internationale de justice. La Russie doit cesser immédiatement toutes ses opérations militaires en Ukraine. Elle doit se retirer du territoire ukrainien et respecter ses frontières internationalement reconnues. Je vous remercie.
I thank France for their statement. And I give the floor to the representative of the United Arab Emirates.
Madam President, I thank Undersecretary General Nakamitsu for her briefing, and we listened carefully to Mr. Kovalik's remarks. When the Council last considered the issue of arms transfers in the context of the conflict in Ukraine 3 months ago, we expressed our concern that the risk of these arms transfers would be compounded if both sides were intent on achieving a military victory and the conflict were to become a protracted one. Unfortunately, the prospects of reaching a negotiated settlement have not grown appreciably closer in the intervening months. Still, there have been signals of a widening recognition that talks are the inevitable path to a durable peace. The UAE is steadfast in its belief that there simply is no military solution to the war. A sustainable end will have to come through negotiations. With that in mind, as the war continues, we must mitigate the attendant risks. In all military conflicts, it is vital to safeguard weapons during transfer, storage, and deployment so they may not inadvertently fall into the wrong hands, particularly terrorist groups. On that note, the UAE welcomes announcements of efforts to mitigate risks associated with arms transfers. That includes plans tailored to the transfer of high-tech weapon systems and regional programs to enhance anti-trafficking capabilities in the region. We also welcome other recent initiatives aimed at strengthening illicit arms trade prevention related to the conflict in Ukraine. The volume and type of arms involved in this case necessitate greater vigilance and transparency. We support calls, such as that by the High Commissioner for Disarmament Affairs today, for effective arms control measures. Madam President, war is not only inhumane and causes untold suffering, but it is also fraught with unintended consequences. The Council has a responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security and an obligation to Ukrainians and people around the world. For its part, the UAE continues to actively support and facilitate mediation and de-escalatory confidence-building measures, and we stand ready to support all efforts towards a peaceful resolution. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the United Arab Emirates for their statement, and I now give the floor to Albania.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank High Representative Nakamitsu for her information. Since the very beginning of this war, we have permanently pointed out the very key aspect of the war in Ukraine. It is a war of choice, an aggression against another country, a blunt violation of international law and the Charter of the United Nations. Everything else we hear or say about developments in Ukraine derives from this. In return, since the very first day, Ukraine has defended itself, has resisted, has pushed back the aggressor, and has called the world for help. Helping Ukraine to defend itself from a brutal war is a moral duty. It is also an essential security imperative, since Russia's actions undermine seriously European and global security and stability. Albania is proud to be among those doing what it can to help Ukraine and Ukrainians. We are assisting a country whose very existence is under threat to resist and escape to the war it has not chosen. International law is crystal clear. A country under attack has every right to defend itself under Article 51 of the United Nations Charter. Ukraine has been under attack for 10 months and is simply defending itself. Its sovereignty, its territorial integrity, and its political independence have been assaulted, which makes self-defense not only a natural right, but also an existential imperative. Therefore, whoever is helping Ukraine in whatever way, legally and openly, is helping not only a nation in need, a nation in danger, a nation under threat, they are also upholding the law and protecting the UN Charter. Therefore, the issue here is not what means Ukraine is provided to resist aggression. In fact, as we are called to speak about lethal weapons, the real and very disturbing issue is the transfer of killing drones to Russia by Iran, in flagrant violation of paragraph 4, Annex B of Security Council Resolution 2231. These drones, first denied and later admitted, delivered by Iran and used by Russia to attack civilians and civilian infrastructure throughout Ukraine, are the real question, the one that needs a clear answer. We expect the Secretary General, in implementing Resolution 2231, to provide soon a full report on the matter. Madam President, we have said it before and want to reiterate. Instead of abusing the time and resources of this Council with meetings like this one today, we should concentrate on real issues. As we speak, Russian attacks are causing casualties, destroying civil infrastructure, in particular the energy supply system, leaving millions of people without access to electricity, heat and water, punishing everyone without distinction. And this constitutes a violation of international humanitarian law. Those who disrespect the law must face consequences. Those who commit crimes must be held accountable. Therefore, Madam President, I would like to conclude by saying that nothing, even less an overused and consumed false narrative, prevents anyone to see the terrible reality in Ukraine, the crimes committed there, but more than anything, the need to stand in full solidarity with Ukraine.
its resistance, and its right, the right to decide on its policies, to choose its friends and its future. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Albania, and I now give the floor to the representative of Kenya.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank USG Izumi Nakamitsu and Mr. Kovalik for their briefings. We take note with extreme concern the ruinous damage the war is causing in Ukraine's lives. Ukraine's legitimate right to sovereignty and territorial integrity and regional and international security. As the Council debates the conduct of war, as we have done so often, including 2 days ago, we must reiterate our calls that every effort be deployed to stop it. We must be more responsive to our fundamental mandate to maintain international peace and security comprehensively. We acknowledge the heavy responsibility Ukraine must bear in defending our internationally recognized borders. While conscripting, training, and arming one's army in times of war is expected, the impact of proliferation of weapons is bound to have a big impact, not only in the country in conflict, but also beyond. Madam President, we are faced with a multi-pronged global crisis from the war in Ukraine. Besides the magnitude of food insecurity threatening especially developing countries and a more complicated multilateral order, we must now move to urgently address the unprecedented proliferation of weapons. None of these challenges can be effectively addressed with the war raging on. As the first and foremost effective step, the war needs to end. Kenya, therefore, calls for specific and sustained efforts to reach arrangements to deliver a minimum level of de-escalation and deconfliction while establishing channels of dialogue that will lead to stability. Finally, Madam President, we again call for a cessation of hostilities and for a political settlement that respects the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of Ukraine. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Kenya for their statement. I give the floor to the United States.
For your informative briefing this morning. We all know that actions speak louder than words, but before we discuss Russia's actions, let's discuss Russia's words here in the Council today. It continues to confound my delegation that we are all, once again, brought into this Council to devote our attention to Russia's fictions. In the midst of, and in spite of, its war of aggression against its neighbor Ukraine, Russia has wasted countless hours of the Council's time on fictional dirty bombs in Ukraine, a claim debunked repeatedly by the IAEA inspectors. They wasted our time on fictional biological weapons, supposedly to be delivered to Ukraine's near neighbors on the wings of birds and bats, claims rejected by this Council and rejected by the states parties to the Biological Weapons Convention. Russia uses these stories, these words, to try to distract us from its own aggression. For example, Russia claims that its forces are not committing atrocities, when there's a host of credible reports from a broad range of sources that members of its forces have committed rape, torture, and summary executions in Ukraine. Russia has not come here today to present us with any credible solutions, and these are not credible accusations. What we are seeing is, frustrated on the battlefield, Russia has resorted to destroying Ukraine's critical and energy infrastructure from afar, causing immense suffering to civilians, as we heard just 3 days ago, and defying the international community's call to end its aggression. Despite all of this, Russia has the gall to demand today in the Council that the international community watch from the sidelines as Moscow seeks the destruction of another UN member state. Western assistance to Ukraine is in the face of Russia's illegal, brutal invasion is not the problem here. It is Russia's invasion itself. That is the one attribute common to all of Russia's fictions, to all its words. To find any distraction, no matter how odious, no matter how transparently false, to try to shift our focus from the immense and needless suffering Russia has caused and continues to cause to the people of Ukraine. It is Russia that has cynically called for this meeting, alleging an illicit conspiracy of weapons transfers from Ukraine, when, in fact, as others around this table have noted, it is Russia that is complicit in Iran's illegal transfer of unmanned aerial vehicles to Russia in violation of Security Council Resolution 2231 Annex B. Russia continues to use these Iranian UAVs in its war against Ukraine and attacks against civilian infrastructure and cities, which have led to the deaths of civilians. Let me be clear. We've seen no credible evidence of diversion of U.S.-provided equipment. We heard no credible evidence of diversion this afternoon in this Council. We would certainly review evidence to support these claims, whether it came from a head of state or international law enforcement official, if it is produced. We would do that because the United States takes very seriously our responsibility to protect our defense and dual-use technologies and to prevent their diversion. At the same time, the United States is committed to continuing to support the people of Ukraine as they defend their country and their freedom. We are not hiding this support. As others have said, Ukraine has every right to defend itself, and we have every right to continue our long-standing support to its defense. Though we have seen no credible evidence of Ukraine diverting U.S. origin arms and munitions, we must all recognize an inherent risk of weapons capture and diversion on the battlefield in any armed conflict. We have always taken, and the United States continues to take, proactive steps to mitigate this risk. What we have seen is Western origin systems captured by Russia in Ukraine. Russia is, in fact, the only known vector of diversion. Russia has an incentive to spread disinformation about diversion and indeed to actually divert U.S. weapons in order to create a false narrative about our assistance that spuriously discredits Ukraine and seeks to weaken international support for Ukraine's self-defense. The Ukrainian government has committed to appropriately safeguarding and accounting for transferred defense equipment. It is important that we remind ourselves that this equipment is vital to Ukraine's defense, and so Ukraine has a strong incentive to protect it. We welcome the Ukrainian government's formation of a commission to strengthen the monitoring of donated military equipment just this summer. We continue to work closely with our Ukrainian government partners to ensure all assistance continues to be properly used and safeguarded as Ukraine defends its sovereignty and territorial integrity against Russia's ongoing aggression. Helping Ukraine keep and regain control of its sovereign territory is an important factor in limiting potential illicit diversion by Russia's forces, Russia's proxies, criminal groups, terrorist organizations, or other non-state actors. Consistent with our commitment to the serious responsibility of safeguarding against diversion, in October, the United States government published the U.S. plan to counter illicit diversion of certain advanced conventional weapons in Eastern Europe. This was a comprehensive, whole-of-government approach that also engages our allies and partners. While this is a recent publication, it is not a new plan. We have been working to address the risk of diversion since well before last February, including in close cooperation with our allies and key partners. This plan has three main lines of effort. We'll quickly, first, working with Ukraine's authorities to monitor and control sensitive and dangerous arms. Secondly, strengthening border controls inside and around Ukraine. And third, enhancing law enforcement capability in neighboring countries. Madam President, while the Russian government is heavily invested in spreading disinformation to justify and distract the international community from Russia's unprovoked war against Ukraine, we and our allies remain firmly committed to supporting Ukraine as it defends its territorial integrity and civilian population against Russia's aggression. And so we take these allegations of diversion of U.S. origin weapons from Russia's officials or pro-Kremlin sources with a healthy dose of skepticism. I will conclude on the subject of diversion with a statement of fact. The most effective path toward reducing conflict and any risk of illicit diversion of arms would be for Russia to end the war that it started and withdraw its forces from all of Ukraine's sovereign territory. This may begin to relieve Russia of its dependence on its many corrosive fictions. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement. I give the floor to Gabon.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam
Je
President.
remercie la haute représentante du Bureau des Affaires
The
de
High
Désarmement,
Representative for Disarmament Affairs,
Izumi Nakamitsu, et Monsieur Daniel Kovalik
and Mr. Daniel
pour
Kovalik
leurs exposés respectifs.
for their respective
Je
briefings.
salue la participation
I
à cette
welcome the
réunion
participation in this
de
meeting
l'ambassadeur
of
de
the ambassador
l'Ukraine.
of Ukraine.
Madame la Présidente,
President,
ce Conseil se réunit à
this
nouveau
council
ce
is
jour
meeting once again
pour la
today
seconde fois
for the
cette
second time
semaine
this week
sur la guerre en Ukraine.
on the war in Ukraine.
Je voudrais réitérer
I
notre
wish to
refus de la
reiterate
guerre.
our rejection of the
Je
war.
réitère
I
également
also
l'appel constant de mon
reiterate
pays
my
aux partis
country's
pour des
constant
négociations de
appeal
bonne
to the
foi
parties for
en vue de
negotiations
trouver
in
une
good faith
solution
with a view to
diplomatique.
finding a diplomatic solution.
Personne ne peut prédire
Nobody
le potentiel de
can predict
déstabilisation
the
et
destabilizing
d'insécurité
potential
qu'auront
and
les
the
nombreuses cargaisons
insecurity
d'armes
which
utilisées dans
would
le
be caused
cadre
by
de
the
cette guerre.
numerous deliveries
Mon
of
pays
weapons
appelle les
used in
parties
this
à
war.
respecter
My
leurs
country
engagements
calls upon the
en
parties to
matière de droit
comply with their
international
commitments under
humanitaire
international
en s'abstenant
humanitarian law
d'utiliser des armes de
by
destruction
abstaining from
massive
using
et en ne
armed
prenant
weapons
pas
of
pour
mass
cible les
destruction
populations civiles
or
et les
targeting
infrastructures civiles.
civilians and civilian
Les parties
infrastructure.
sont tenues d'éviter que
The
les
parties
civils
have
ne
an
se trouvent
obligation
pris
to avoid
au piège
civilians
des
falling
mines terrestres.
victim to
Les
landmines.
parties doivent éviter toute action
parties must
pouvant
avoid
infliger
any
des souffrances
action which could
supplémentaires
inflict
aux
further
populations
suffering
civiles
on
et
civilians.
permettre un déploiement
We must
sans
allow
entrave
for
de l'aide
unhindered
humanitaire.
delivery of humanitarian
Madame la
aid.
Présidente, à mesure que la guerre s'enlise,
President, as the war
les
becomes
accusations
entrenched,
croisées de menaces d'utilisation d'armes de
accusations are
destruction
increasingly flying back and
massive,
forth about
voire
threats
d'armes
of the
nucléaires,
use of weapons
se
of mass
font jour.
destruction or even nuclear
Une
weapons.
telle issue rendrait
Such an
les
outcome
auteurs
would
responsables
render the
d'une
perpetrators
catastrophe aux
responsible
conséquences
for a catastrophe
irréparables.
with irreparable
Mon pays
consequences.
condamne toute
My
utilisation
country
d'armes aux
condemns any
effets
use
indiscriminés,
of
ainsi que toute utilisation
weapons with
d'armes
indiscriminate
téléguidées
effects or
dont les
use
cibles
of
privilégiées
uncrewed
sont les
weapons
populations
whose
civiles.
targets
Nous
are
exhortons les
civilians.
parties à cesser toute
We
escalade
urge the
verbale
parties to
et
cease from
militaire,
any verbal
ainsi
or
que toute
military
action de
escalation
nature à
or
envenimer
any
les
actions which could fan
antagonismes.
the flames of
Il est temps
antagonism.
de faire taire les
It
armes
is
en
time to
Ukraine.
silence the weapons in
Plus
Ukraine.
d'armes, c'est assurément
More
plus de guerre,
weapons will
plus de
undoubtedly
morts,
mean more
plus de
war,
destruction,
more death,
plus
more
de détresse et
destruction,
plus
more
de victimes
distress,
parmi les
and
populations
more
civiles.
civilian victims.
Une surenchère dans ce domaine ne profiterait à
One-upmanship in
personne.
this area can
Elle
benefit
nuit
nobody.
à la recherche de la
It will
paix
jeopardize
et ne
attempts
sert qu'à
to
alimenter
achieve
les
peace
animosités.
and will merely stoke
Je voudrais terminer en
antagonism.
rappelant que
I
ce
wish to
Conseil
conclude by
a un
recalling that
rôle
this
de
council
premier
has a
plan
crucial role
à
to
jouer
play
dans la recherche de la
in
paix.
seeking peace.
Mon pays continuera de se
My
tenir
country
aux
will
côtés de
continue
ceux
to stand
qui
shoulder to shoulder
proposent
with those
des
who are
voies
proposing
alternatives au
alternatives
langage
to
des
the
armes.
language of
Je vous
weapons.
remercie.
I thank you.
I thank the representative of Gabon for their statement. I give the floor to Mexico.
Muchas gracias,
Thank you
señora
very much,
presidenta.
Madam President.
Agradezco a la
I
alta
thank
representante
the
Nakamitsu
High
y al
Representative
señor
Nakamitsu
Kovalik
and Mr.
por
Kovalik
sus
for
presentaciones.
their briefings.
Tal y como lo expresamos en
As
septiembre
we
pasado,
said last September,
durante todos estos meses en los que
throughout
el
all of the
Consejo de
months of
Seguridad
debate in the
ha
Security
debatido
Council
sobre el conflicto en
on the
Ucrania,
conflict in Ukraine,
México se ha referido
Mexico has constantly
constantemente
referred
a la
to the
importancia y a la
importance and
necesidad
necessity
de poner especial
to pay
atención
particular attention
a las implicaciones
to the
que tienen
implications
las
of
transferencias
weapons
de armas.
transfers.
Reconociendo el artículo 51 de la Carta de las Naciones Unidas, la preocupación de México sobre las transferencias de armas no obedece solo a la situación actual. Se remonta a los inicios del conflicto en el este de Ucrania en 2014. El impacto de las armas utilizadas en este conflicto es omnipresente, pero el precio más alto lo han pagado los civiles, con sus vidas y con la destrucción de zonas habitacionales e infraestructura, incluidos hospitales y escuelas. Si bien algunos exportadores han hecho declaraciones relacionadas con las precauciones que han tomado para las ventas y los envíos de armas, dado el alto volumen de transferencias, es prácticamente imposible mantener bajo control todo el ciclo de vida de estas armas. Y no digamos los riesgos inherentes al tráfico y desvío de las mismas. Estas circunstancias son inevitablemente explotadas por las organizaciones criminales. La proliferación de armas en posesión de civiles tiene múltiples y muy riesgosas implicaciones. De manera más reciente, hemos tomado nota de los diversos alegatos sobre transferencias de vehículos aéreos no tripulados. Independientemente de su origen, estos también han sido utilizados en contra de civiles y de infraestructura civil, lo cual es a todas luces violatorio del derecho internacional humanitario. La organización Small Arms Survey ha publicado informes sobre la transferencia de una amplia gama de armas que van desde rifles hasta sistemas de defensa aérea portátiles. Tales informes también alertan sobre el número creciente de armas en posesión de civiles sin ningún tipo de registro. A mediados de noviembre, una corte en los Países Bajos emitió una sentencia en contra de aquellos involucrados en el derribo del vuelo MH17 de Malaysia Airlines, ocurrido en el este de Ucrania en 2014, argumentando que fue resultado de la transferencia de un sistema denominado BUC de misiles tierra-aire. Todos estos informes sugieren que en efecto no hay un control eficaz de las transferencias de armas. Todos los países que son parte del Tratado sobre Comercio de Armas deben apegarse a sus disposiciones, especialmente en lo referente a la denegación de transferencias que estarían en violación del tratado, así como en la aplicación de los estrictos análisis de riesgo que estipula el propio tratado. Pero igualmente llamamos a aquellos países que todavía no son parte del ATT a cumplir responsablemente con los más altos estándares de precaución en sus transferencias, con criterios de objetividad, más allá de los intereses de empresas privadas o de carácter geoestratégico. El asunto es, pues, crítico, toda vez que la vida de muchas personas en realidad depende de él. Por lo mismo, subrayamos que más allá de las decisiones actuales para la aprobación de nuevas ventas y transferencias, es tiempo de empezar a establecer medidas más específicas para el control de armas antes de llegar a la etapa postconflicto, a la que llegaremos. Mientras más tiempo pase, será más difícil lograrlo y las consecuencias de no haberlo previsto a tiempo las resentirá de nueva cuenta la sociedad civil. Señora Presidenta, es posible que esta sea una de las últimas ocasiones en las que México se refiera al conflicto en Ucrania como miembro electo de este Consejo. Por ello, quiero reiterar la postura de mi país. La vía militar no ofrece una solución cercana ni viable.
Swift or a
Es
viable
tiempo de que el
solution.
Consejo de
It is
Seguridad y
time
la
for the
comunidad
Security Council and the
internacional
international
se
community
enfoquen en
to
promover
focus
más el
on
diálogo
better
y los
promoting
entendimientos
dialogue and
diplomáticos.
diplomatic understandings.
No hay que descartar las opciones de
Mediation
mediación,
options must not
las
be
ya
ruled out.
conocidas y las que puedan surgir.
Mediation options
Poner
that are
fin
already
al
known and
suministro
could
de
arise.
armas
Bringing an
presupone
end to supplies of
negociación
weapons will require
y tregua.
negotiations and a truce.
Presidenta, México reitera su
Madam
compromiso
President, Mexico
con el
reiterates its
respeto a la
commitment
soberanía,
to the respect
la
for the
independencia
sovereignty,
política y
political
la integridad
independence and
territorial de
territorial
Ucrania
integrity of Ukraine
dentro de sus fronteras
within its
internacionalmente
internationally
reconocidas.
recognized borders.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much.
I thank Mexico for their statement, and I now give the floor to Brazil.
Thank you, Madam President. I would like to thank High Representative Izumu Nakamitsu and Mr. Kowalik for their inputs. Madam President, over the years, this Council has sought to incorporate into its agenda issues whose relationship with international peace and security is not always clear. Interestingly, the nexus between weapons and armed conflict has received less attention. This linkage is explicitly recognized by the main instrument of international law on conventional arms exports, the Arms Trade Treaty, which commits exporting states to consider whether arms transfers would contribute to or undermine peace and security. On the other hand, all states have the inherent right to self-defense, as enshrined in the UN Charter, and consequently the right to acquire arms for their security, including from outside sources. It should also be recalled that the ATT explicitly prohibits transfers of arms and ammunition that would be used in the commission of genocide, crimes against humanity, grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions of 1949, attacks directed against civilian objects or civilians protected as such, or other war crimes. In the past years, we have witnessed the phenomenon of the growing urbanization of conflicts, the increasing involvement of non-state actors, and the use of methods and means of war that do not comply with the principles of distinction and proportionality. Additionally, we see a risk regarding the problem of illicit trafficking of conventional weapons and ammunition. The weapons now being used in the conflict in Ukraine will possibly fuel, in the future, other conflicts in different regions of the world. As to the case in point, it should be recognized that the supply of arms and ammunition to the parties to the conflict in Ukraine might result in prolonging it and in more suffering for the civilian population. On the other hand, it is undeniable that a state has a right to self-defense in case of violation of its sovereignty and its territorial integrity. It is a principle enshrined in the UN Charter. This discussion, however, distracts us from fulfilling our mandate, which is to maintain peace and security, and therefore work towards a ceasefire and negotiations. We must bear in mind that international humanitarian law, norms, and principles are mandatory at all times and under all circumstances. Respecting and ensuring respect for international humanitarian law is not only a legal obligation, but also an effective way to protect civilians. Madam President, Article 33 of the UN Charter assigns to the Council the responsibility to explore avenues of dialogue in favor of the peaceful solution of disputes. And I quote, "The Security Council shall, when it deems necessary, call upon the parties to settle their disputes by such means." End quote. After more than 9 months of conflict in Ukraine, we must recognize that this body has still to fulfill its mandate. Brazil is concerned that signs of openness to dialogue have been in short supply. Last July, the Black Sea Grain Initiative provided, in the words of USG Rosemary DiCarlo, a beacon of hope for all in the face of a global food crisis. There have also been occasional arrangements to exchange prisoners of war. The harsh reality, however, is that the belief in the feasibility of a military solution continues to be present, and not only by the parties to the conflict, whatever the cost in terms of human suffering. Madam President, once again, we reiterate the call for an immediate ceasefire without preconditions. Saving human lives must take precedence over any consideration, including the just desire for reparations and punishing those responsible for war crimes. Brazil adds its voice to those of other members in favor of dialogue and recalls that the world looks to this Council in the expectation that it will fully exercise its responsibility to stop this spiral of violence. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank Brazil for their statement. I give the floor to Ireland.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you, High Representative Nakamitsu, for your briefing. I note the presence of Mr. Kovalik. Madam President, the facts surrounding the war in Ukraine are clear. Ukraine was a peaceful, independent country. Russia chose to upend that peace and to violate Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. It did so in 2014 when it illegally annexed Crimea. It did so again this year when it launched its brutal war of aggression. What is less clear is the justification for today's meeting called by the Russian Federation. Ukraine did not commit or threaten to commit an armed attack against Russia. It was Russia which attacked Ukraine and which cynically sought to justify its invasion by invoking Article 51 of the UN Charter. It is Russia which now seeks to deny Ukraine its entirely legitimate right of self-defence as enshrined in the UN Charter. Ireland, along with all EU member states, rigorously implements our international obligations. We apply the EU common position, under which EU member states assess exports of military technology and equipment against a range of criteria, including a specific criterion on risk of diversion. Attempts by the Russian Federation to frame this urgent and necessary support for Ukraine's defence as an uncontrolled supply of weapons are once again a poor attempt at obfuscating their grievous actions. The EU and its member states are determined to support Ukraine for as long as it takes. We are greatly concerned by the manner in which Russia is acquiring and using unmanned aerial vehicles in Ukraine, as well as reports of ballistic missiles obtained from Iran in contravention of Resolution 2231. The comments by the DPRK ambassador to Moscow that his country is to supply Russia with ballistic missiles in contravention of Resolution 1718 is also of serious concern. Russia's actions risk undermining these essential resolutions and the authority of this Council. For its part, Ukraine has sought to restore peace. President Zelensky has offered a roadmap to peace, his 10-point peace plan to end this senseless war. Russia has responded with a barrage of missile strikes, bringing further death and destruction, further worsening the humanitarian crisis which Russia's war has caused. Madam President, we ask that Russia stop trying to use this Council as a platform for its disinformation, to paint itself as the victim of its own aggression in the face of the heinous actions it has committed. Instead of using disinformation to falsely blame others, Russia should cease its aggression against Ukraine and should do so immediately. Ireland once again calls on Russia to withdraw its troops and engage in good faith, in dialogue and diplomacy to bring about a peaceful resolution of the conflict in line with international law and the UN Charter. Millions of lives in Ukraine depend upon this. Thank you.
Thank you. I would now like to deliver the following remarks in my national capacity. At the outset, we thank Under-Secretary General for Disarmament Affairs, Ms. Izumi Nakamitsu, for her detailed briefing. The trajectory of the Ukraine conflict is a matter of profound concern for the entire international community. We believe that internationally agreed principles and regimes should be respected and upheld by all countries. This Council would recall that since the commencement of the conflict in Ukraine, India has been consistently calling for an immediate cessation of hostilities and for an end to violence. We have emphasized that dialogue and diplomacy are the only way forward. Actions that exacerbate the conflict should be avoided. Rather, all efforts should be made to de-escalate and bring both sides to the negotiating table. As our Prime Minister has said, today's era is not an era of war. In a globalized world, the impact of the conflict has not just been limited to Europe. We've all experienced its consequences in terms of surging costs and shortages of food grains, fertilizers, and fuel. The Global South, in particular, is feeling the pain acutely. We must therefore not initiate measures that further complicate the struggling global economy. On our part, we are providing humanitarian assistance to Ukraine and economic support to our neighbors under economic distress. We very much hope that the international community will continue to respond positively to the call for humanitarian assistance. India has dispatched 12 consignments of humanitarian aid to Ukraine so far, and we stand ready to do more. India's approach will be to promote dialogue and diplomacy with an overarching aim to end the ongoing conflict and work with other partners to mitigate emerging economic challenges, particularly to the developing countries. Colleagues, it is in our collective interest to work constructively, both inside the United Nations and outside, towards seeking an early resolution to this conflict. In conclusion, I reiterate that the global order is anchored in the principles of the UN Charter, international law, and respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states. Thank you. I now resume my duties as the President of the Council. The representative of the Russian Federation has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give them the floor.
Спасибо, госпожа председатель.
Thank you, Madam President.
Мы всех внимательно выслушали и попросили слова для того, чтобы привлечь ваше внимание к тому, что по теме сегодняшнего заседания, последствиям накачки Украины оружием, наши бывшие западные партнеры не выдавили из себя ни слова. И это несмотря на приведенные сегодня факты и свидетельства. Вам просто нечего на это сказать. Поэтому вы продолжаете использовать нарратив, сводящийся к повторению одних и тех же тезисов на каждом заседании. По вашей картине мира во всем и всегда виновата Россия. Других объяснений у вас уже давно нет. В этой своей слепоте и глухоте вы продолжаете курс, который может привести к последствиям глобального масштаба. Это стало еще более очевидным после сегодняшнего заседания. Так вот, дамы и господа, хочу подчеркнуть, что вам не удастся свалить на Россию вину за то, что украинские каратели из вашего оружия убивали и продолжают убивать мирное население Донбасса, которое они терроризировали с 2014 года, а также за то, что из-за процветающей коррупции украинских, европейских и американских чиновников оружие из Украины оказывается в руках международных террористов и помогает разжигать конфликты в других
terrorism and helps fuel conflicts in other regions of the world and kill peaceful civilians there. No one who can watch our meetings will be left with any doubt about the consequences of what you're doing, the consequences they will have in undermining international peace and security, and the denial into the microphone by our American colleagues of obvious facts and trends. Their desire to continue uncontrollably pumping Ukraine with weapons will be fully assessed by the unbiased members of the United Nations, but also the American taxpayers themselves. And if only because of that fact, convening the meeting today was definitely a worthwhile undertaking. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Russia for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Well, thank you, Madam President. Distinguished members of the Security Council, Under Secretary General Nakamitsu, I also recognize the remainder of representatives of terrorist Russia in the permanent seat of the Soviet Union. It is becoming grotesque, and soon it won't be a surprise to see Leo Tolstoy's major work called Special Operation and Peace to comply with Putin's laws. After all, it is also a mix of fictional narrative, history, and often perverse philosophy, like many Russian statements in this chamber. If somebody right in your face tells you that, and I quote, Eastern Ukraine had good reason to join Russia, end of quote, or an even more delusional quote, Russia's intervention in Ukraine is legal under international law, end of quote. Who in their right mind would refer to the author of these statements as an authoritative source in this global watchdog of international law and order? Of course, there is freedom of speech in this country, including for alumni of otherwise respectable university. But for God's sake, even in a city where cannabis is now legal, there is no need to fill this chamber with the smoke of conspiracy spam. Russia again attempts to legitimize its flagrant violations of the UN Charter by using the Council as a platform for circulating its propaganda narratives. It is a very simple algorithm that Moscow has explored since Soviet times. But as you said yourself, Mr. Kovalik, you are an American and you can say what you want. Of course you can. But why in the world do you waste our time? Neither American taxpayers nor ours do approve this frittering away their money. Let me remind you that the largest country in the world, the Russian Federation, pays less than 2% of UN regular budget. It hardly covers this debauchery. First, you have to blame the victim, and the more resolutely the victim resists, the more assistance it receives from responsible nations. The graver the accusation should be. Second, the lie should be wrapped up in numerous terms and names, technical characteristics and numbers. All these are supposed to make fakes look like facts. In particular, we have never heard from Moscow why mass graves and torture chambers have been found only in the places where Russian troops were deployed. We can only imagine what we will find in the territories that still remain under Russian occupation. What we do know for sure is the sooner these territories are liberated, the more Ukrainians can be saved. We will therefore continue to deoccupy our sovereign territories in strict accordance with Article 51 of the UN Charter. Any other option would be a betrayal of our compatriots who have been compelled to stay in the occupied territories and are now waiting for liberation. We are grateful to all friends and allies who support Ukraine in this noble endeavor, including by supplying modern weapons. Their use has been an element of Ukraine exercising the inherent right to self-defense under the above-mentioned Article 51 of the UN Charter. Madam President, Russia brought the same allegations to the attention of the Security Council on the 8th of September. Let me remind you what happened afterwards. The armed forces of Ukraine launched its operation to liberate the east and south of the country. Since September, thousands of square kilometers in Kharkiv, Kherson, and Luhansk regions were liberated. This is the most powerful and viable evidence that all weapons in Ukraine's possession serve their intended purpose: to help Ukrainian soldiers to liberate our people and our territories. To prevent their illegal use, Ukraine has created and ensured the effective functioning of a multi-level system of arms control. It is carried out on three tracks: circulation and use of small arms and light weapons, export control, and control and supervision of weapons and military equipment transferred by foreign countries. Circulation and use of small arms and light weapons has been controlled on an interagency level that includes the Ministry of Interior, Security Service, State Border Service, as well as other governmental structures responsible for combating illegal arms trafficking. The State Service of Ukraine for Export Control, as well as Interagency Commission on Military and Technical Cooperation and Export Control, are responsible for practical implementation of the state policy in the area of export control over international transfers of dual-use and military goods, as well as implementation of measures to prevent their use for terrorist and other illegal purposes. Ukraine has also established a three-level system control and supervision of weapons supplied by our foreign partners. The parliamentary oversight is carried out by the Temporary Special Commission. The President exercises his constitutional duties through the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine. A special system called SOTA has been implemented there to monitor weapons and equipment supplied by foreign partners, makes it possible to receive information about every single sample of such weapons. At the governmental level, the Ministry of Defense and Armed Forces of Ukraine, together with foreign partners, carry out direct control and monitoring, including through the use of Logistics Functional Area Services System, LOGFAS. LOGFAS allows the monitoring of arms supplies to Ukraine, as well as the movement of international technical assistance. In addition, auditors of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine carry out field inspections of weapons supplied by foreign partners. At the same time, we remain extremely concerned about the activities of illegal armed formations, including the infamous Wagner Group, in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. These formations widely recruit people with criminal backgrounds in Russia and use weapons that are not subject to any control mechanisms, including internal Russian ones. Given the fact that Wagner Group is reported to operate on other continents as well, the threat of illicit arms trafficking stemming from the activities of Russian private military companies is more than real and worth being addressed by the Council and relevant international mechanisms. In eastern Ukraine, the Ukrainian side, both its civil and military representatives demonstrate transparency and commitment to cooperating fully with our partners as well as within international export control regimes. We will continue to act in this vein as it is fully in line with our main task, full deoccupation of the sovereign territory of Ukraine within its international recognized borders. Following the defeat of Russia and the end of the war, the demilitarization and denuclearization of Russia should take place. It will prevent the threat of the repetition of aggression, thus laying a solid foundation for both the transformation of Russia into a peace-loving nation and for ensuring sustainable peace and security. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.